The thunder rolled across the vast Montana sky like a warning as Preston Grayson stared at the empty hand that had just moments ago held 3 kings. Across the table, Walter Simmons' smug grin widened as he revealed a straight flush, a damning spread of cards that now owned everything Preston had worked for since arriving out west in 1878. "Looks like Whispering Creek Ranch belongs to me now," Walter said, gathering the deed that Preston had foolishly wagered in a desperate attempt to double his fortunes after a punishing drought had nearly bankrupted him. Preston stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the oil lamp-lit saloon. At 32, he had the weathered face of a man who'd seen both fortune and hardship, his dark hair peppered with premature gray at the temples. "You played me fair, Simmons. I'll be off your property by dawn." The year was 1885. And Preston Grayson had just become a man without land in a territory where a man without land was barely a man at all. He spent that night sleeping under the stars, his horse tethered nearby, his few possessions packed in saddlebags. Morning found him riding aimlessly, his future as empty as the vast horizon before him. He'd come to Montana territory with dreams of building something lasting, something that would wash away the memories of the war between the states that still haunted him. Now those dreams had been scattered like dust in the prairie wind. By midday, his horse was tired, and Preston himself was parched. Coming upon a modest homestead with a windmill turning lazily in the breeze, he decided to ask for water. As he approached, he noticed the place had seen better days. The fence needed mending, the barn roof had several missing shingles, and the fields looked undertended. But smoke rose from the chimney of the small farmhouse, suggesting someone was home. He dismounted and approached cautiously, removing his hat. "Hello, the house," he called, following the custom of the frontier. The door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch, a rifle held confidently but not threateningly in her hands. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot and eyes the color of summer sage. "State your business," she said, her voice firm. "Madam, I'm just looking for water for myself and my horse. Been riding since dawn." She studied him carefully, then nodded once. "Water's at the well. Help yourself, then be on your way." As Preston led his horse to the well, he couldn't help but notice more signs of neglect around the property. A wagon with a broken wheel sat abandoned near the barn. Several fence posts leaned at precarious angles. This was a place struggling to survive. After watering his horse, Preston approached the woman again. "Madam, I don't mean to pry, but your fence could use some attention. I'd be willing to mend it in exchange for a meal if you're amenable." She frowned slightly. "What's your name, stranger?" "Preston Grayson, madam. Faith Norwood," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Mrs. Faith Norwood." Preston nodded, understanding the significance of the title. "My condolences, Mrs. Norwood." "It's been 2 years," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Thomas died of fever, left me with this place and more work than one person can manage." She seemed surprised at herself for sharing so much with a stranger. Preston nodded again. "My offer stands. I'm good with my hands." Faith studied him, weighing caution against necessity. Finally, she lowered the rifle. "There are tools in the barn. Fix the north section, and there'll be stew waiting when you finish." For the next few hours, Preston worked on the fence, grateful for the physical labor that kept his mind from dwelling on his misfortune. The wood was weathered but still solid, and by late afternoon, he had repaired the worst sections. When he returned to the house, Faith had a pot of rabbit stew simmering over the fire. They ate in silence at first, but eventually, Preston felt compelled to explain his situation. "Lost my place yesterday," he admitted between spoonfuls. "Whispering Creek Ranch, about 20 miles east." "Made a fool's wager in a poker game." Faith's eyes widened slightly. "Whispering Creek, that was a good-sized spread. 300 acres, had 30 head of cattle, good grazing land." Preston stared into his stew. "Had." "Foolishness, wagering land on cards," Faith said, though her tone held more resignation than judgment. "Won't argue that," Preston replied. "Now I'm a man with nowhere to go and not much to offer except 2 good hands and a willingness to work." Faith was quiet for a long moment. "Where will you head?" Preston shrugged. "Montana's big, figured I'd ride on, maybe find work as a ranch hand somewhere." Faith stared out the window at her struggling farm, then back at Preston. Then you'll live on mine forever, she said quietly. Preston looked up, startled. Madam. I need help, she said simply. This place is falling apart around me. Winter's coming and I won't make it alone. Stay on as my foreman. There's a small cabin out back where Thomas kept tools. You can fix it up, make it livable. Mrs. Norwood, it's not charity, she interrupted. It's an arrangement. You work the land, help rebuild. We split whatever profits come. If things improve, maybe we can even expand someday. Preston considered her offer. It wasn't ownership, but it was purpose, and right now that was something he desperately needed. Seems you're taking an awful risk on a stranger who just admitted to losing everything on a bad bet. Faith's mouth curved in a hint of a smile. Sometimes losing everything is exactly what teaches a man to value what matters, and so it was decided. Preston moved into the old tool shed that same day, clearing out years of accumulated junk and making space for his bedroll. It was crude shelter, but it was better than another night under the stars with winter approaching. The next morning, he rose before dawn and began assessing the property in earnest. Faith's land consisted of about 80 acres, with 20 cleared for farming. The rest was a mix of pasture and woods. A small creek ran along the eastern boundary, providing good water. The soil seemed rich enough, though parts had been overworked. When Faith emerged from the house, Preston was already making notes on a scrap of paper. You're up early, she observed, carrying a basket to collect eggs from the chicken coop. Thought I'd get a sense of what we're working with, Preston replied. Your late husband started some good projects. Foundation for expanding the barn is already laid. With some work, we could double your livestock capacity before spring. Faith nodded, a flicker of appreciation crossing her features. Thomas had big plans, just ran out of time to see them through. Over the following weeks, Preston threw himself into the work of rehabilitating the Norwood farm. He repaired the barn roof, rebuilt the chicken coop, and cleared irrigation channels for the fields. Faith worked alongside him, her strength and determination impressive. They fell into a rhythm, rising with the sun and working until dusk, taking meals together in the small farmhouse kitchen. As October turned to November, the air grew sharper, carrying the promise of snow. Preston had managed to transform the tool shed into a serviceable cabin, with a small stove for heat and a proper bed frame he'd constructed from timber cut on the property. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace after supper, Faith asked the question that had been on her mind. What made you stake everything on a card game, Preston? He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Pride, foolishness. The drought hit us hard this year. Lost nearly a third of my herd. Bank was calling in loans. Thought I could double my money quick and save the ranch. He shook his head. Instead, I lost it all. Faith nodded, understanding in her eyes. Thomas was like that, always looking for the quick solution. Borrowed too much to buy equipment we didn't really need. Is that why? Preston began, then stopped himself. Why I'm struggling, Faith finished for him. Partly he left debts, not overwhelming, but enough to make things tight, and running a farm alone, it's not just the work. It's the decisions, having no one to turn to when things go wrong. Preston met her gaze across the firelit room. You're not alone anymore, Mrs. Norwood. Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that transcended their business arrangement. Faith looked away first, rising to clear the dishes. It's getting late. We have an early start tomorrow if we want to finish reinforcing the barn before the first snow. As Preston walked back to his cabin that night, he realized that for the first time since losing Whispering Creek, he felt a sense of purpose again. And perhaps something more, a stirring of feelings he hadn't expected to encounter in this unexpected chapter of his life. The first snow came in mid-November, a gentle dusting that transformed the landscape overnight. Preston woke to a world of white and found Faith already outside, checking on the animals. Beautiful, isn't it? She said when he joined her, her breath visible in the cold air. Makes everything look new, Preston agreed, handing her a cup of coffee he'd brought from the house. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and both of them lingered a moment too long before Faith withdrew her hand. Thank you, she murmured, turning her attention to the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. As winter settled in earnest across the Montana territory, Preston and Faith fell into a comfortable routine. Days were filled with chores caring for the livestock, repairing equipment, and planning for spring planting. Evenings were spent by the fire, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes sharing stories of their lives before circumstances had brought them together. Preston learned that Faith had come west from Pennsylvania as a new bride 5 years earlier, full of hope for the future. She spoke of Thomas with respect, though Preston sensed their marriage had not been without challenges. In turn, Preston told Faith about growing up in Virginia, fighting in the war when he was barely 18, and his decision to head west afterward, seeking a fresh start far from the ravaged landscapes of his youth. "Do you ever regret coming out here?" Faith asked one evening in early December as they sheltered from a blizzard that howled around the farmhouse. Preston considered the question carefully. "Not for a moment. Even losing Whispering Creek, I still believe this is where I belong." Faith nodded, her hands busy with mending. "I questioned it after Thomas died, thought about selling, going back east to my sister's family, but something keeps me here." She looked up, meeting Preston's gaze. "This land gets in your blood." "That it does," Preston agreed softly, aware that it wasn't just the land that was beginning to claim his heart. Christmas approached, bringing with it a brief thaw. Preston rode into town for supplies and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to Faith on Christmas Eve. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Just a small token," Preston said, suddenly feeling self-conscious. Faith carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful hairpin with a mother-of-pearl flower. "Preston, it's lovely," she breathed. "But you shouldn't have spent your money, please," he interrupted gently. "It's Christmas, and you've given me far more than I could repay." Faith hesitated, then reached under the small tree they'd cut from their own land and decorated with paper chains. She handed Preston a package of similar size. "I had the same thought, it seems." Inside, Preston found a new leather wallet, hand-stitched and embossed with his initials. "You made this," Faith nodded, a blush coloring her cheeks. "From the hide of that old saddle we found in the barn. Do you like it?" "It's the finest gift I've received in years," Preston said honestly. That night, as Preston walked back to his cabin under a sky brilliant with stars, he acknowledged to himself what he'd been feeling for weeks. He was falling in love with Faith Norwood. The realization both elated and troubled him. She was still in many ways his employer, and he had nothing to offer but his labor and loyalty. And though they'd grown close, Faith had given no clear indication that she saw him as anything more than a partner in her struggling enterprise. January brought brutal cold and a troubling visit from the bank manager, Mr. Peterson, who rode out to inform Faith that her mortgage payment was overdue. "Times are hard all over, Mrs. Norwood," Peterson said, not unkindly as they sat in the farmhouse kitchen. "But the bank has investors to answer to. I can give you until the end of February, but after that." After he left, Faith sat at the table staring at the papers he'd left. "I thought we'd have more time," she said quietly. Preston studied the figures. "How much do you need?" $50 to make the payment, another $30 to keep us current," Faith sighed. "With what we've set aside for seed in the spring, we're 20 short," Preston thought for a moment. "The cattle auction in Helena is next week. I could take those 2 steers we've been fattening." "Might fetch enough to cover it." Faith shook her head. "We were counting on those steers for our own food and to trade for equipment." "We'll manage," Preston insisted, "one step at a time." The journey to Helena was arduous in the winter conditions, but Preston successfully sold the steers for a fair price. On his return journey, however, disaster struck. A sudden snowstorm forced him to seek shelter in a cave for 2 nights, and his horse, spooked by wolves, bolted with most of his supplies and half the money from the sale. When Preston finally stumbled back to the farm, frostbitten and exhausted, Faith was beside herself with worry. "I thought you were dead," she cried, helping him into the house and immediately setting about treating his frozen extremities. "When your horse came back alone yesterday, I'm sorry to have worried you," Preston said through chattering teeth. Faith worked silently, her face tight with concentration as she applied salve to his frostbitten fingers and wrapped them carefully. "What happened to the money?" she finally asked. Preston's heart sank. "Lost half of it when the horse bolted." "Barely managed to keep this much," he said, producing a sad little bundle of bills from inside his coat. Faith counted it quickly. $32, not enough for the mortgage payment. I'm sorry, Faith, I failed you. Preston had never felt lower than in that moment. To his surprise, Faith gripped his bandaged hands gently. You nearly died trying to save my farm. Don't you dare apologize. They sat in silence, both contemplating what this setback meant. Finally, Faith spoke again. There might be another way. Josiah Werner at the general store has been asking to buy our black walnut trees for years. Thomas always refused, said they were the finest timber on the property. Preston knew the trees. She meant a magnificent stand of mature black walnuts on the north edge of the property. That timber's valuable, could be worth a lot more in a few years. We don't have a few years, Faith said pragmatically. We need that money now. The next day, despite Preston's still recovering condition, they rode together to town to speak with Werner. The storekeeper could barely contain his excitement at the prospect of finally acquiring the prized timber. I'll give you $30 for the lot, he offered, his small eyes calculating. Those trees are worth 3 times that, Preston countered, indignant. Werner shrugged. Maybe in better times, but cash is tight and you folks seem in a hurry. Faith stepped forward. $45, Mr. Werner, not a penny less, and you handle the cutting and hauling yourself. After some back and forth, they settled on $40, with Werner agreeing to leave the smaller trees untouched. It was a bitter compromise, but combined with what they'd salvaged from the cattle sale, it would be enough to make the mortgage payment with a small margin to spare. As they rode home, Preston brooded over the transaction. We sold those trees too cheap. Given time, I could have found a better buyer. Time is the one thing we don't have, Faith reminded him. Besides, they're just trees, the land is what matters. Preston glanced at her, struck by her practical wisdom. You're right, of course, I suppose I'm still learning that lesson. Faith smiled, the winter sun catching in her auburn hair. For a man who lost everything on a wager, you still put a lot of store in possessions. Not possessions, Preston clarified. The future, those trees represented possibility. There are other possibilities, Faith said softly, her eyes meeting his briefly before she turned her attention back to the trail. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Faith brought out a bottle of blackberry wine that had been saving for a special occasion. What are we celebrating? Preston asked as she poured 2 glasses. Survival, Faith said simply, handing him one, and new beginnings. They touched glasses, and Preston felt a shift in the atmosphere between them. Faith seemed to be studying him with new eyes. I've been thinking, she said after a moment, about our arrangement. Preston's heart sank. Was she going to ask him to leave now that the immediate crisis had passed? Yes, it seems unfair, Faith continued. You work as hard as any owner would, yet you have no real stake in the outcome beyond your wages. I'm grateful for what you've given me, Preston said quickly. A roof, purpose, I'm proposing something different, Faith interrupted. A true partnership. Equal shares in whatever this land becomes, whatever we can build together. Preston was stunned. That's exceedingly generous, Faith, but are you certain? Faith set down her glass and moved to sit beside him on the small sofa. There's something else I need to say, Preston. Something I've been feeling for some time now. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the determination in her eyes and the gentle curve of her lips. Preston found himself holding his breath. I care for you, Faith said simply, more than as a friend or business partner. I didn't expect it, and perhaps it's too soon after Thomas, but Preston reached for her hand, his heart hammering in his chest. It's not too soon if that's what your heart is telling you, because mine has been saying the same thing for months now. Faith's eyes widened. Truly. I love you, Faith Norwood, Preston said, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. Have for some time now, but I didn't think I had the right to say it, not when I came to you with nothing but the clothes on my back. Faith touched his face gently. You brought far more than that. You brought hope back to this place, and to me. When their lips finally met, it was like coming home to a place Preston hadn't known he was seeking. Faith's kiss was warm and certain, carrying the promise of all the possibilities they had just begun to imagine together. Spring arrived with renewed purpose. The mortgage paid and their partnership now extended in every sense, Preston and Faith worked side by side to prepare the fields for planting. The loss of the walnut trees was a visible reminder of their winter struggles, but new growth was already appearing throughout the property. In April, Preston rode to Helena for the spring cattle auction, this time returning triumphantly with 5 healthy heifers purchased with their carefully saved funds, the beginning of a new herd that would diversify their farm's output. "It's a start," he told Faith as they watched the animals explore their new pasture. "In a few years, we could have 20 head or more." Faith leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "A few years, I like the sound of that." As summer approached, Preston found himself thinking about the future in ways that extended beyond crop rotations and livestock breeding. One evening, after a particularly satisfying day of work, he took Faith's hand and led her to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property. "I've been thinking," he said as they sat on a fallen log watching the water flow past. "This spot here would make a fine place for a proper house, room for a growing family." Faith looked at him questioningly. "Are you proposing something, Preston Grayson?" Preston smiled and dropped to one knee before her. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band purchased with his share of the profits from their first successful hay harvest. "Faith Norwood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't promise you'll never face hardship again, but I can promise you'll never face it alone." Tears glistened in Faith's eyes as she pulled him to his feet. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "1,000 times yes." They were married on a perfect June day in 1886, with half the county in attendance. The ceremony was held on their own land, under an arbor Preston had constructed from saplings taken from the very spot where they planned to build their new home. That evening, as twilight settled over the land that had brought them together, Preston and Faith stood on the porch of the farmhouse, now their house, and looked out over the fields they had worked together. "Do you ever think about Whispering Creek?" Faith asked, nestled against his side. "Regret losing it?" Preston considered the question seriously. "I used to in the beginning, but now I understand it was the best bad hand I ever played." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I lost a piece of land, but I found a home. And the woman I want to share it with for the rest of my days." Faith's smile was radiant in the fading light. "Forever is a long time, Mr. Grayson." "Not nearly long enough, Mrs. Grayson," Preston replied, drawing his new wife into his arms. "Not nearly long enough." Over the following years, the Grayson farm flourished under their combined efforts. The small cabin Preston had once inhabited became a workshop where he crafted furniture during the winter months, developing a reputation for quality that brought customers from as far away as Helena. Faith, meanwhile, expanded their operation to include beekeeping and a small apple orchard, innovations that provided additional income during lean years. When drought came again in 1889, they were prepared, with diversified crops and carefully managed resources that saw them through while other farms failed. Their family grew as well. In the spring of 1887, Faith gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth. 2 years later, a son they called James joined the family. By 1892, they had completed the new house by the creek, a comfortable 2-story home with room for their growing family and the future they continued to build together. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Preston would reflect on the strange path that had led him to this life. How the darkest day of his past, sitting across from Walter Simmons and watching his dreams vanish with the turn of a card, had ultimately guided him to greater happiness than he could have imagined. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Preston and Faith would sit together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sun set over the land they had nurtured from struggling survival to thriving prosperity. "I never did thank Walter Simmons properly," Preston remarked once, his arm around Faith's shoulders. Faith laughed softly. "For cheating you out of your ranch." "For sending me down the road that led to you," Preston corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best wager I ever lost." Faith turned in his arms, her face illuminated by the golden light of sunset, still as beautiful to him as the day she'd stood on her porch with a rifle and offered a stranger water. "Then you'll live on mine forever," she whispered, echoing the words that had changed both their lives. "Forever," Preston agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as twilight settled over the land they both called home.